Welcome, everybody, to the Ramalinga Swami Center. We are excited to host today, as part of our center's colloquium series on equity and social determinants of health, Dr. Deepa Sinha. Many of us may already be familiar with her writing from editorials in major newspapers, so we are thrilled to have her here today. Deepa Sinha is a development economist with nearly 20 years of experience in teaching, research, and policy advocacy. Her areas of expertise include social policy, especially related to public health, food and nutrition, and gender and child rights. She's been at the Ambedkar University in Delhi for the last 9 years, where she has taught undergraduate, postgraduate students, as well as supervised research students. Prior to that, she worked as a senior researcher and advisor with the Office of Commissioners to the Supreme Court on the right to food. She has independently managed research studies and been part of many large international research collaborations. She's been a member of various policy-related committees of states and union governments in India, as well as the governing bodies and advisory boards of independent organizations. So she has done a lot, I think, for food, nutrition, and food rights in this country. She continues to work closely with civil society networks and campaigns in India and globally. She continues to be actively involved with the Right to Food campaign and writes, as I said, regularly in national and international journals and newspapers and magazines as well. We ask all of our attendees to put their questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, not the chat box, and we will try to bring them up in the discussion that will follow Dr. Deepa's talk. Thank you for being with us here today, Deepa. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Abha. I'm just sharing my screen. So basically, there are two things that I want to address today. One is just looking at the trends in undernutrition in India, basically comparing NFHS 4 and 5, and putting forward some hypotheses on explaining those trends, and also related to that, discussion on the relevance of the international growth standards. So like I think many of us might be familiar, we know that undernutrition statistics in India have been quite poor for a very long time. And especially compared to other countries of similar economic standing, our outcomes in stunting and wasting for children have been quite low than what would be predicted by our economic growth and per capita incomes, which are in itself not very good, but even relative to that, the child nutrition outcomes are quite poor, although they have been improving. So in this figure, we see the trend from NFHS 3 onwards, which was in 2005-06, to the latest, which is 2019, actually 2019 to 21, because there was the survey was disrupted in between due to COVID and then completed later in 21. And that is also a caveat for what I'm presenting here, that we still don't really know how COVID affected the survey itself. And there are some puzzling features in the sense, just one to give an example, that the 20 odd states which were covered before COVID, many of them saw a reduction, an increase in the proportion of children who were stunted, whereas that got reversed in the states that were covered after COVID, which is a little contradictory to what we would have expected, because COVID, one would expect, and that we have seen, at least in terms of food consumption, had quite a negative effect on people's diets because of the lockdowns and so on. But also stunting is something which is more chronic, so we'll probably not see the effect on stunting in this survey, but maybe in the next NFHS. So overall, while the reduction was from 48% to 38% from between NFHS 3 to 4, between 4 and 5, there is a reduction. That trend sort of continues, but there's probably a slight slowdown, although between the first two periods, there is a 10-year gap, and between the next two surveys, there's a 5-year gap. But even if we calculate a per annual rate of reduction, there is a slowdown in the reduction, although the trend is going on. And wasting is another story. In this presentation, I'll mainly be focusing on stunting, which is a measure of chronic undernutrition. Along with undernutrition, we also have the other end of the spectrum. The proportion of women or men who are overweight and obese has also been going up quite quickly. From now, 24% of women are overweight or obese, and almost 23% men. And we know that this is related to a number of non-communicable diseases, the having high blood sugar levels or elevated blood pressure, which was measured for the first time in NFHS 5 this time. If I don't know if I'll have the time to talk about this very much, but if I do, basically that and as I will argue as we go along, that diets are a big issue in terms of dietary diversity and the quality of food that people are consuming. And somewhere the political economy of undernutrition and overnutrition is actually the same in terms of what is the food that people are able to access and eat across class and caste, while taking into account the variations that exist. Like I don't have the figure, or it might come later, is basically anemia is another issue of concern, where between NFHS 4 and 5, we see that actually anemia has gone up amongst women and children. So like I was saying, there are a number of discussions that have come out in terms of this data and these trends that we see from official from Niti Aayog and the ministry and so on how they look at it in the economic survey in various op-eds that we see. One issue that has been argued is, firstly, like I was saying, if we look at the annual rate of reduction, then we do see a slowdown. Secondly, if we compare it with the targets that the government of India set for itself in the Poshan Abhiyan, then we are way beyond those targets. But the positives, which I think need to be interrogated, one of these which has been said is that there is a convergence between the states, in the sense that the states which had higher levels of stunting have seen a greater reduction than states which had a slower level, so that the interstate variation is probably reducing, is one of the things that has been talked about. If we look at the 22 major states between NFHS 4 and 5, we see that 7 states, and I've listed the states in the slide, show an increase in the prevalence of stunting, while 4 show a very negligible improvement of less than 1 percentage point in comparison with NFHS 4. So it's almost stagnant. And if you look at it, this includes a number of states which are considered to be better off normally. Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, Goa, and so Andhra Pradesh in the overall national picture. But at the same time, so that might meet convergence, but when you look at these states and what is going on, the fact that so many states are seeing an increase in the prevalence of stunting is an issue of concern. And from what I have seen in the literature, stunting growing up, that is the proportion of children under 5, on an average, the heights of children being less than 2 standard deviation from the reference population mean, is not something that is usually observed. And it does indicate some sort of distress or some stress in the economy, in the lives of people, which I think needs to be investigated much more, which we miss out when we look at the all India numbers. In contrast, between NFHS 3 and 4, there was no single state which showed an increase in stunting prevalence. And the smallest decline between those two rounds was seen in Tamil Nadu and Jharkhand, which was about 4.3 percentage points. So I just tried to look at one argument, of course, could be that these are low-hanging fruit, and therefore there's states which have high levels of stunting see greater reduction, which is quite true. But at the same time, if we just look at the states where you list them by their stunting level at the initial level and what is the change that they saw, and here a positive means that there's a reduction in stunting in this figure. And we see that in both rounds, it is true that there is this positive relationship, which is that as the initial level of stunting is higher, the percentage reduction in stunting is also higher. But this relationship is flatter when you look at the earlier round, NFHS 3 to 4, but when compared to 4 to 5. Once again, saying that when you look at this change, it is these richer states or the better off states which have seen a flattening in the stunting, and we need to understand why that is going on. If we look at it by social groups, again, it's a familiar pattern where you see that the prevalence of stunting is highest amongst the Dalit and Adivasi populations, whereas amongst what the surveys call others, which is mostly upper caste Hindus, the prevalence is much lower. And that trend has continued across the rounds. And again, one could argue that there is some amount of convergence that is going on over here. Similarly, by wealth quintile as well, you see this big difference that is there. where amongst the poorest, while still 46% children are stunted, amongst the richest quintile, it is 23%. Once all of this just to show that there are these great variations within India across state, across region, across, I didn't put the urban and rural here, but of course there's a difference between urban, rural as well, by wealth and by social categories. This is something that we know. On the face of it, it also seems that there is a convergence that is going on, in the sense in all of these you find that the reduction in stunting, just by looking at the percentage reduction, is faster amongst the more marginalized states or social groups or wealth quintiles. But is it really low-hanging fruit is a question, and I'm not really answering that question decisively in this presentation. Like I said, I'm putting forward some hypotheses here and hope that people will take this forward as we work. So I just try to compare it with other countries to see that have we reached a stage where that reduction in stunting has become very difficult. So if you just compare stunting prevalence, for instance, with all of these countries that I've chosen in the slide have per capita incomes less than that of India. And the stunting prevalence is also lower than that of India and lower than India's average. That is the striking thing here. For instance, Bangladesh, which has an overall prevalence of stunting 28%, compared with the others category in India, that is the richest, has a prevalence of 29%. So what is prevalent for the upper castes in India is higher than the overall average for Bangladesh, which we know is a poorer country. Similarly, if you look at the richest wealth quintile in India, almost 23% there are stunted, compared to, say, Vietnam, which again has a much lower per capita income, where only 20%, this is all Vietnam average, not the richest in Vietnam, is 19%. So what we see here is that it is not the case that India has probably reached the best that it can, and therefore that it is slowing down, but what some economists have called a leveling down in another context. In the context of per capita incomes and consumption expenditure particularly, where we look at the 2017-18 data, although that report was junked by the government, but that data also shows that there is this convergence that you're seeing is more because that amongst, if you look at the entire bottom 80% together, then the improvements in living standards have been quite slow. The effect of demonetization and GST on the economy has been something that has affected almost everybody except for probably the top 1% or 10% of the economy. So while inequality is increasing, what we see is that the inequality is getting really concentrated. So we are getting closer to the American 99 versus 1 kind of situation. Whereas if you look at the overall, and about 90% of our labor force is in the informal sector, and this was quite badly affected by these economic changes. And it is, I'll come back to this, then why are there improvements in the poorer states? I think it's because of other determinants. I'll come back to this later. But given all this data, looking at this high prevalence amongst the rich and amongst the upper caste, there has been a resurgence of the question of whether the growth standards we are using are correct at all or not. And some who have argued, and this is again not new, there were earlier, about 10 years back, you had Panagaria writing about this in a similar fashion. And again, recently, one of our chief economic advisors had a paper on this. Basically, the argument being that the growth standards that we use to evaluate whether a child is stunted or not is not suitable, and that they are global growth standards and do not take into account genetic differences, and maybe therefore India should have a different set of growth standards. So I'll just go over what are these growth standards and why many of us think that the global growth standards that we use are relevant for India and we must continue using them. This is based on a paper that I did with Vandana Prasad and Rohit James. So I'm just summarizing, and it's mainly based on a review of literature. So currently, when we measure undernutrition, what we call undernourished is those who are less than -2 standard deviation away from the reference of the WHO growth curves. And the WHO growth curves are based on this multi-center growth reference study, which India adopted in 2008. And after we adopted these growth standards, there was one wouldn't call it increase, but compared to the previous standards that we were using, there was an adjustment that was made in NFHS 3 to the undernutrition figures like we see in the table below. The earlier standards that we were using, the NCHS standards, were based only on children from the US, whereas the current standards are based on a multi-center growth study. So the questions used, like I said, is basically that based on these based on these growth standards, the prevalence of stunting in India is very high, even amongst the wealthiest quintile, and slow improvements has stated in policy concern. So in this context, it is argued that heights are genetically determined, and therefore you cannot have one standard for the entire world. And the more recent paper also argued that these growth standards are not relevant for India because they do not take into account the effect of maternal heights on the way children grow, and that it needs to be adjusted. And therefore, the conclusion being that the MGRS study needs to be reviewed, validated, and also currently the latest is from what we know that ICMR is conducting a study in India to see what different growth standards we can have. There are also different academics who have tried to use the existing NFHS data to make these adjustments and show how the prevalence rates would change if we don't use the WHO growth standards, but use something which is based on children in India. For example, there is the Ghosh et al. Paper, which makes a correction using NFHS and Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey data, according to which the stunting would be actually 15.5%, not 35%. Another Subramaniam et al. Paper, which makes an adjustment based on maternal heights, where the stunting prevalence would then be 24%. A maternal height adjusted stunting would be 24 rather than 35. So this is an important policy issue to sort of resolve and understand, because once again, at the highest spaces, these questions are coming up. The first thing when you review, and many of you might be familiar with this as you work on the issue, but a lot of economists and social scientists and policymakers who are using these data and asking these questions, one finds are not really familiar with these differences. And a lot of the critique that comes out does not understand this difference between growth references and growth standards. Growth references describe how children grow and can be applied to other children to establish whether or not their growth is typical of the reference group. So in the case of growth reference, you can choose a reference population, which, like these papers that I mentioned do, could be the top quintile in NFHS for India, and then compare the rest of the children with them. On the other hand, growth standards represent a healthy pattern of growth based on a selected reference sample, and they show how children ought to grow rather than how they do grow. So the MGRS, which was explicitly aimed at arriving at standards and not references, was based on a set of healthy children who got an environment which did not constrain growth in any way. So the MGRS sample meets the study's expectation of no economic, environment, or biological constraints for growth. It did not even aim to represent the larger population or even the richest or the top quintile of India. That was not the purpose. The purpose was to select children. India was one of the countries of the 6 countries in the MGRS study, and the purpose was to select children who got a favorable environment for growth, taking into account the economic standards, sanitation, access to health services, feeding practices, all of this. That if you put all this together, then how do children grow, irrespective of whether they are in the US or in Norway or in Ghana or in India or in Oman or in Brazil? These were the countries that were included in the survey. And therefore, one of the responses to the numbers that I just showed would be that those which are based on these large-scale survey data sets, like the NFHS or CNNS, they do not include comparable samples. Those surveys do not have any data on incomes. And we do know that those surveys also underrepresent respondents from very rich households. Usually the NFHS and NSS surveys, it is known that the sampling itself is done in such a manner, and the way the surveys take place, there is an underrepresentation from very rich households. Therefore, the top quintile in NFHS does not really represent the top quintile in India, number one. Number two, the top quintile in India itself is very heterogeneous, where, for instance, where 18,000 rupees per month is the average incomes of people. You can imagine all of us are in the top quintile, but within that also there are variations, and that cannot be seen from the NFHS survey. Also, the quality of the survey when you're conducting a study to set standards versus conducting a study to look at prevalence rates would be very different. So those cannot be used. And something very important that one needs to take into account is that the MGRS study also included certain interventions, in the sense that it was a longitudinal study for one part of the sample where people went back and counseled the families on appropriate infant and young child feeding practices. And therefore, what you see in the MGRS sample is really a set of children who got a favorable environment by all means. And then you look at it. So what it is trying to really capture is to see that when there are no constraints, then do children grow similarly across the world? And they kind of establish that they do. This is just one data to show where it has the growth curves from all the different 6 countries in the survey, and you can see that they're quite closely placed. I won't go into the details of this. This is quite widely published and discussed, but basically to say that the MGRS survey, the questions on the sample size, the sample selection, on whether the data of these 6 countries could be pooled or not, these are the kind of methodological questions that are raised in relation to the WHO MGRS survey, based on which standards are used. Those questions have been quite sufficiently answered by the literature that has come out from the study group itself. The confusion comes up only when we make this mistake of evaluating them as reference curves representative of a certain population and not as standards, which are of children who are growing in a favorable environment. Even when we look at maternal heights and genetics, while some have argued that downward revision, that maternal genetics can be seen as, maternal height can be seen as a constraint on growth, because it is true that at an individual level, maternal height is a factor for growth of the child. But we must also understand once again, what is the purpose of setting these growth standards? If it is to look at what is growth failure, we in a population, we also have to understand that low maternal heights themselves are a reflection of intergenerational transmission of poverty. So the mother is short because she also had a childhood where she was undernourished, and probably her mother was short as well. So that being captured within the growth figures, within the stunting figures, is something which is natural, and something that is not entirely undesirable if we want to look at what is the kind of progress that we are making. Along with that, we also see that there is a sluggish growth in maternal heights in India. Deaton and Race have written about this, and you find that the rate at which heights are increasing for men and women in India, while they are increasing for both, they are increasing much faster for men than compared to women. We also see that height increases in a state like Kerala is comparable with historical experience of other countries in Europe. Once again, therefore, countering the genetics argument. Therefore, basically, overall, if we are adjusting for maternal stature, then we are underestimating the contribution of the deficient environment on a child's stature, and taking attention away from the intergenerational nature of required interventions through impacting maternal nutrition. So while one is not saying that maternal heights do not play a role in determining child's growth, that is part of the deprivation that one is measuring. And if we understand that stunting is basically a representation of the overall deprivation and unfavorable environment in which children are growing, then one sees the merit in actually using growth standards. So basically, in terms of this whole debate on the methodology and the standards to be used, one thing that's quite clearly is that the MGRS has clearly stated that its objective is of setting growth standards and not references. So the study was designed accordingly. Second, despite it focusing on privileged, it focused on privileged children, but this sample showed that stunting across, that you could have a global standard, and there could be relevant comparisons, that this genetic argument and argument that therefore different countries need to have different standards does not really work. And also data shows that neither is child stunting nor maternal stature something that is immutable. Adjusting for maternal stature fails to account for the deficient environment. And we have to understand that population distribution and individual trajectories are to be interpreted differently. So for instance, one other concern with using what maybe some argue are the wrong growth standards for India. One concern is a macro concern that it shows India in a poor light and India's rankings are lower compared to other countries, which we have discussed so far, that if we understand that it is a standard and it is representing overall deprivation then and a deficient environment, then we have to take what the lessons are from those numbers and where we are going wrong and not really question the standards. The second concern that is sometimes raised is that this might misclassify children who are actually growing appropriately as being undernourished and therefore overfeed them, leading to other kinds of results, which one does not, that might be the case with a few children, because there are always, even in a growth chart which is relevant, you would always have children along the tails. So when any individual response, if a child goes to a doctor and the doctor is the pediatrician is treating the child for a particular condition, then of course they don't only look at the growth chart, while that is an important thing that they do look at, but they would correlate it with other kind of metrics before deciding what kind of treatment needs to be given. And that I think pediatricians understand quite well. But even for the general population, therefore, to even simple things like, it does not mean that a short person has a low intellect. It only means that on an average, that a distribution needs to look a certain way if everything is okay, but that average distribution itself is shifted to the left in India's case, where the mean therefore is much low, shows more than 1/3 of our children being stunted. And experience, like I showed a little bit earlier, once again, if you look at many other countries, you see that stunting is elastic, that this argument that it is very difficult to increase heights of children does not really hold. Once again, if we compare with many countries and look at the average annual growth rates, reduction in stunting, you see that these countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, Asian countries, have reduced their stunting at much faster rates than India has. Brazil and Thailand seem to have a slower stunting rate, but that's because they saw a drastic fall in the 70s and 80s, and they are at levels where it is not considered a public health issue anymore. Even within India, we see that different states have a different rate at which stunting is reducing, which again tells us that stunting is not immutable and fairly high rates of reduction are possible within the same country. Therefore, stunting basically needs to be understood as a metric of deprived environments. And within that, we then look at, if you look at the relationship with income and nutrition, for instance, one knows, and there is a lot of literature around this as well, that there is a two-way relationship. Poor nutritional status contributes to lower incomes in the long run and lower economic growth, whereas improved nutrition contributes to increasing productivity, better nutrition outcomes in childhood, early child development, contributes to improved productivity and higher economic growth in the longer term. It's also been seen, particularly Brazil experience, that reduced inequalities, reduced poverty, all of this contributes to better nutritional outcomes. And malnutrition is also poverty. So it is not, so to keep making this comparison and saying, how can we have a malnourished population if we are seeing a positive economic growth rate, doesn't really make sense. It only means that the growth itself is skewed and that there is something wrong with our growth model, that despite having an economic growth, we are seeing malnutrition increasing. And if we understand poverty or development as being multidimensional, then we know that we have to focus on all of this. And if we do that, then stunting is actually a metric which is very suitable for assessing absolute deprivation, because it requires both nutrition-specific programs as well as broader progress to actually see improvements in stunting. This is something, again, many of you would be familiar with. The center is Ramalinga Swamy Center, where they pointed out that, for instance, the difference, Ramalinga Swamy was amongst those who pointed out that this puzzle of higher undernutrition in South Asian countries compared to Africa can actually be attributed, at least partly, to the gender differences between these two continents and the status of women. So there are all these factors that go into finally determining how children grow. It's women's status, infant and young child feeding, sanitation, all of these which contribute to improving nutrition along with overall economic progress. And a number of these factors we know, and there are many examples, that they can be improved even at current levels of income, which is why when we see India's data in terms of gender outcomes or in many of these other things, you see that there are other countries which are poorer but doing better when it comes to these other indicators. Therefore, we argue in our paper that questioning the standards is actually taking attention away from the problem. It's diverting the issue. What there is a need for is to focus on determinants. And there is an urgent need to shift away from a sole focus on just stunting, but looking at stunting, wasting, undernutrition, anemia, all of this together, and invest in all these different causal pathways. So this not just looking at so this extreme other argument of, okay, incomes are fine, but children are still undernourished, which means that behaviors are wrong, is also not correct. But to look at all of this together, infant young child practices, reducing poverty, increasing maternal education, and so on. And there is if we look at the data for each of these in India, there is a lot of scope to improve outreach, coverage, etc. This is the determinants of child and maternal nutrition that, again, many of us would be familiar with, the UNICEF framework. So when we look at the determinants of maternal child nutrition, we know that the immediate determinants are diets and care, but these are enabled by the overall governance system, the politics, the resources, the distribution, the kind of food systems there are, the kind of health systems there are, the access of services that exists. And if we look at each of these determinants, we see that, like I was saying, there are big gaps. For instance, if you look at exclusive breastfeeding, now it's about 63% in India. Early initiation, which really with the increasing institutional delivery should have been close to 100%, is still less than 50%. And then when we take a step backwards and see, okay, what is it that is needed to enable these to happen? We know that maternity entitlements, for instance, does not exist for more than 90% of women in this country. So if a woman is to exclusively breastfeed a child for 6 months, how is she expected to do that when there is no paid leave? There is no way she can take off from work for such a long period. Similarly, this is, of course, the most shocking and striking figure, which is that in the age group of 6 to 23 months, the proportion of children receiving an adequate diet is only 11%. And this is adequate diet as defined by WHO, which looks at the number of times a child is fed in a day and also the different food groups that are included in a daily diet. If we look at access to services, while there has been some improvements, we also know that the quality is not great. For instance, if you look at mothers who had at least 4 antenatal care visits, it's still about 58%. Receiving food supplements from the ICDS is only about 60%. Only about 60% children were weighed in the 12 months preceding the survey by the ICDS, according to the responses. And in this, again, we know that just receiving the food supplement is also not enough because the quality is quite poor. Their protein content and micronutrient content and just the taste itself is not good enough. And the quantity is so little. In the context of families where they do not have enough food, it's quite obvious that that supplement that is given is shared by the entire family. So although it is 62%, that is much lower than what would be required even for those who are getting it. We don't have much data on diets in India recently after the NNMB surveys were paused and the CNNS has not released its entire data. The NFHS 5 does ask the adults on what is the food consumption that they have, but it does not tell us still anything about quantities. So for instance, even if a spoon of milk was added in the tea, we might see that they are consuming milk. Despite this very weak indicator, if you look at these items, which is fruits, eggs, fish, chicken, and meat, once again, you see that the consumption is really low and lower amongst women compared to men. But it's only around less than 50% women who eat eggs or fish, chicken or meat on a weekly basis, which means that they're eating it occasionally or never. These are the four responses that the NFHS has, or same is the case with fruits. And these dietary diversity indicators also, they vary largely by wealth. And the other women's indicators as well, we see India does quite poorly. So the proportion of women who are in paid employment is very low. Women who have land in their names is again low. We did see an increase in women having bank accounts, which is largely due to the Jan Dhan Yojana program, where bank accounts were opened. But then there are other studies which also tell us that these accounts are not, most of them are zero balance accounts, they have no transactions and they're inactive. Even as of 2021, only 41% of the women in reproductive age, which is the respondents for the NFHS survey, had completed 10 or more years of schooling. Similarly, if you look at access to clean fuel, improved sanitation facilities, some of these things have improved in the last few years, but still huge gaps remain. The reason for showing all these figures in this quick succession is basically, again, to make that point that once we understand that stunting has these multiple determinants, and then you see that there are gaps when you look at each of these determinants, and there are improvements in some, there are not improvements in many others. And along with this, if we put together the economic data, which is showing that what India is seeing is this K-shaped recovery, where although we have a positive economic growth, that growth is really skewed with the rich getting richer and the poor not doing very well. And when I'm saying the poor in this context, I'm taking quite a broad set of the population, not just the bottom 10 or 20%, but even those who we might consider middle class or lower middle class. If you look at the last 10 years, 12 years, you see that incomes have not been rising very much. And this has also been written about quite a bit. For instance, one of the metrics that you look at, real wages, because India doesn't have income data. If you look at real wage data, you find that wages are more or less stagnant from 2013 onwards, particularly in rural areas, post-COVID in urban areas as well. Larger economic policies affect malnutrition. Like I was saying, demonetization, GST, there is a lot of evidence to show that the way these were implemented has affected the informal sector much more than the formal sector. And we do not have adequate, appropriate data at the national level to actually show these connections, but there exists large number of field studies as well as other data like wage data, like data on purchase of consumption items, like the sales of cycles, two-wheelers, which have gone down, which do show that there is a problem, that there is a large section of the population whose incomes have not increased. And I think that partly, at least, and we need to do much more analysis to establish this. But if you broadly look at the data the way I have done, it seems to be emerging that kind of also explains the story of convergence between states, where you see improvements in those states where some determinants, like say sanitation, access to ICDS, access to the public distribution system, did increase in the last 10 years. And these are the relatively poorer states of UP, Bihar, Odisha, and so on, where after the National Food Security Act, after the total sanitation, the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and so on, there was an improvement in these factors. On the other hand, in the states where we see a decline in the situation of stunting, or in states where you see a stagnation, these are states which already had reached a sort of saturation in terms of the existing kind of PDS or ICDS, or even when you look at figures on access to toilets and sanitation. So the effect of the economic distress was probably higher in the balance in the better off states on people, whereas on the poorer states, we still see some improvements in stunting, because while economic distress is there and was always there were some improvements in these other factors, still with huge gaps, but which did not exist at all in the previous period. So I think we really need to look at the context and these different factors. And although this hasn't yet been done between NFHS 4 and 5, Between NFHS 3 and 4, there is a study that IFPRI did looking at about 5 states on the factors that contributed to reduction in stunting. And they find something like this, that it is not the same factors that explain the trends in every state. In some states, the economic factors have a greater weightage, while in other states, these non-economic factors to do with women's education, access to sanitation, health, and so on have a greater weightage. I mean, what we learn from that is that one needs to do all of this together. Just depending on economic growth does not work, nor does only doing behavior change campaigns work either. And overall, even in the better off states, the level of stunting is high enough to tell us that all of these need to improve much more. So the context in which children are living, is it COVID? Is there displacement? What is the threat to livelihoods? What is the migration situation? The overall inequality? All of this become important when one is looking at trying to explain the stunting rates, and hiding behind saying that the standards that we are using are inappropriate is really taking us away from being, I would say, ambitious for our own children. While it is clear that it is prescriptive, it is something that is aspirational. That's something we must aspire to for our children, that it is possible. There is nothing in the Indian genes which is stopping children from growing. We have to look at where the gaps are and have to address them. So even the direct interventions like the focus on young children, the Poshan Abhiyan needs to be seen in this broader context. Otherwise, there is the danger of falling into the trap of saying that people don't know how to feed their children, as if that is the only problem. While there are gaps there is the issue of enabling environment for breastfeeding, of availability of creches for childcare, access to a diverse diet. The public distribution system, let's remember, has now a wider coverage, but still gives only rice and wheat in most states. What is the access to protein? What is the access to be it pulses, but also animal proteins in the form of milk, eggs, and meat? Are people able to afford it? All of these are questions that need to be asked when we are designing these programs as well. Definitely programs such as PDS, NREGA, etc. are important, but that is not enough. What we need is to ensure overall food security. And once again, when I say food security, it's not just about rice and wheat through the public distribution system, but it is about these diverse diets, the wonderful thalis that we see on the posters of Poshan Abhiyan. How does every child, every adult, every person in the country get it? Then a large number of questions are raised. But we do know that then there is a need along with that overall food security, which would raise many questions related to the food system, the kind of agriculture we have, land distribution, prices, incomes, and so on. We do need some comprehensive interventions which directly address women and children as well. There is the focus on children under 6 that is important. So universalization with quality and equity of the ICDS is something we've been talking about for very long. While it is universalized now on paper in the sense that most villages have an Anganwadi center, that's really not enough. One needs to look into the quality of the center, the burden on the worker. Do we need another worker? What is the kind of food that is given in the ICDS? What is one doing with the growth monitoring? One can go on and on about the issues within the ICDS. And if you look at the budgets that have been allocated for the ICDS, also they have been falling in real terms over the last 10 years. Creches, something which has been a demand for a long time for children under 3. We currently don't have anything. There are a few creches here and there, mostly run by NGOs. Even the government creches are through NGOs. But what is it that we have for children under 3? If we are saying that one of the immediate determinants of undernutrition is care, and that the young child needs somebody to feed the child, then one has to understand the lived realities of women and mothers on whom the burden of feeding the child often falls, the kind of work burdens that they have. So who is taking care of this young child? Every woman, every family that needs a childcare center must have access to one, which is not just, again, a place where you leave your children, but it's a place where they're being given good quality food, where their health and nutrition is being monitored. Similarly, maternity entitlements I've talked about. Convergence and all of this, of course, is important. And before the question comes up, the question often is, we have all of this, but implementation is a problem. Firstly, I think the question of implementation also comes when you have all of this in a comprehensive manner and there are enough funds and so on, which we don't have. And even if you do, we also need to have various accountability enhancing mechanisms that are also included in them, like social audits, vigilance committees, and so on. All of these pilots exist within India. They do work when they are done well, when there is a mobilization of the local community. But overall, I want to just conclude again by saying that first, that this entire debate on growth standards is a misplaced debate, and it takes attention away from a large number of other issues. Second, that stunting is a reflection of a deficient environment. And once we understand that, then we need to look at the overall economic situation, the situation of equity and distribution of resources. And within that, what is the programming that needs to be done to address children under 6? And that finally, that this can be done because there are examples within India and outside where when there is a political will, when there is mobilization, that these things are done. The challenge really, I think, is to bring attention back to all of these issues. There is no single magic bullet. That does not mean that stunting is not a problem, nor does it mean that it cannot be addressed in the Indian context. Thank you. I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Deepa. That was a very dense talk with lots of information, figures, data, and so on. And I think it'll, I hope people will revisit this discussion when it's posted on YouTube to look closely at some of the things that you discussed. So that was wonderful. We have a couple of questions, but before we dig into those, I actually have to ask, you made this point earlier in the talk. Why is it important to address not just poverty, but also inequality? You spoke about gender inequality a little bit, but other forms of inequality, I think, are also to be covered by this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So various reasons. One is, again, if you just go by the empirical evidence, the experience of Brazil shows that, there was this whole period where Brazil drastically reduced their stunting prevalence. And at that time, that was not the time of their highest economic growth, but that was a period when inequality reduced. Because when inequality is reducing, that is also telling you about access to opportunities and resources. And if we understand undernutrition is this intergenerational thing, then it is not just about single interventions or incomes going up, but how you are able to participate in the economy depends on where you are in the economy as well. And if there is a widening gap there are a number of pathways through which everything else also gets affected. Just to give an example, for instance, what becomes a priority for public spending also gets affected by inequality. If there is a very wide inequality where very few people are paying taxes and are controlling the politics, then the spending for the poor also reduces, even though they might be less poor in absolute terms than they are before. The kind of schooling systems you have, the kind of health systems you have, all of those are unequal, and those are the ones that are supported. So right from the beginning, the inequality in opportunity kind of perpetuates itself, and that also contributes to nutrition. And then, of course, in our country, gender, I talked about, caste is also a big issue, which is also another form of inequality, which then has an effect on the resources that people have access to, be it common property resources, resources to agricultural land, all of which again affects the kind of diversity in their diets. And even more recently, the kind of attacks on certain kinds of food, I would see that also as an outcome of inequality, to say so much resistance to introducing eggs in school midday meals and ICDS, for instance. Even though most of the children who go to these institutions are those who belong to the poorest communities and backward castes, who would eat them quite as part of their routine diets if they were able to afford them. But why is the voice of the very small minority getting a bigger voice? Again, inequality is there. So of course, one can go on and on, but inequality is as important as the absolute levels.
Yeah. Thank you for sort of explicating that link there, I think. We have actually several questions are from Mr. Raju Jotkar, who I'm going to try and summarize some of what he's saying. So he's talked about how, you mentioned universalization of ICDS as just one, a basket of solutions, but he's pointing out that that itself has a long way to go, that even now in urban parts of the country, and it's still not universal, and that there is a large percentage of the population that's not covered anyway. That's right, huh? If there's anything you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's why I said it's universalized mostly with every village, but even there you have uncovered habitations. But urban is a whole issue. And I should have mentioned that I actually removed the slide because I thought it was getting too much. But if you look at the improvements or the change in stunting between NFHS 4 and 5, that is another puzzle that you see, that the improvement in urban is much slower than in rural also. You know, and that again, I think connects to how these economic shocks as well as the COVID lockdown affected the urban much more than the rural in some ways. The demonetization, GST, and so on, and the services in the urban not being anywhere close to, because most of them are designed keeping the rural areas in mind. So I live in Delhi, and if you look at ICDS centers here, Anganwadi centers are few and far between, and even those that are there, they're running out of scooter sheds. You will have a little garage, which is also a vegetable shop and an Anganwadi center, because the rent that is allocated for an Anganwadi center is so little that in Delhi, even in the slums, you hardly get one tiny room for that rent. So same with the PDS. While the coverage has expanded greatly in rural areas, in urban areas, there are still large sections of very poor population who do not have ration cards or access to ration. So the access to services is more difficult here. When the going is good, there are better incomes and they might be able to access some better food and living standards. But overall, when you look at sanitation, access to water, all of this in urban is quite a challenge.
Right.
And ICDs.
And it's a very different sort of set of circumstances too, right? Sanitation might be an issue for very different reasons in rural or urban areas, or access to food has very different sort of consequences in rural and urban
Correct.
areas, right? So I
Yeah.
think someone else has also pointed out that, this is an anonymous attendee who talks about, that there is the triple burden of malnutrition, overweight, obesity. All of these are sort of playing out in the same at the same time. But I suppose, is that happening more in urban areas than in rural areas?
Not looked at the NFHS data specifically on this, but anecdotally, some things that you see connected, like I said earlier, also that there's certain political economy factors that you can see which kind of explain both your undernutrition and overnutrition and micronutrient. I mean, just the fact of if you take a step back and look at, start from the point of poor dietary diversity amongst Indians, that most diets are cereal heavy, that protein rich foods are low, that micronutrient foods, consumption of these foods are low. And then you see that, okay, who is controlling the food system, right? On either end. You have across the globe now something like 10 companies which are controlling most of the food system, right from the seed to the fertilizer, pesticide, to the final processing and the finished product. And in that context, where you have, so in India, you have this context where you have a large proportion of people who cannot afford healthy foods. And at the same time, you have free sale of ultra processed foods, which are quite cheap with no regulation, no ban on their advertising. So, I mean, it makes sense, like if amongst domestic workers in Delhi, again, for example, it's easier for a woman who works in 4 houses, say early in the morning, to get a packet of biscuits or ask one of her children to make Maggie and eat, than to give them a meal which has
A
micronutrients
nutritious,
and
diverse meal.
yeah, exactly, all of that. And then on top of that, you have all this advertising that goes in. I mean, we've had the whole Bonvita controversy just a few months back.
Right.
You know, all this is also affecting the poor, and there is no regulation on any of this.
Right. A very tricky space to operate in. Actually, I want to revisit what you were saying about the sort of the control of nutrition programs by several companies. And I think the government has largely moved towards addressing micronutrient deficiencies through, fortified foods, which is also this whole process of fortification is in the hands of very, very few companies, right? So Srilata herself says, it doesn't, evidence suggests that this does not actually reduce stunting. So how do we address this? How do we change the narrative around how we address nutritional deficiencies?
How do we change the narrative is a tough question. I think by all of us talking more and more about it, but I think this is one big thing one has been seeing working on nutrition all these years, is this search for a magic bullet doesn't end, and there is no magic bullet. I think we really need to bring attention onto back to food, but not food where it is interpreted as subsidized food through the PDS alone, but to what is it that people are eating, to diets. And then that will, of course, raise a number of challenging issues on improving people's diets, but there is no other way. So to have a rice fortification for anemia, which has a number of problems also, it's one is it's ineffective, two, it could have negative ramifications for certain populations in
Correct.
terms of
Yeah.
health. It could have, there is some like Reporters Collective and others have done these investigations which show that there was a lot of conflict of interest and commercial interest that went into that policy as well.
Right.
Third, so the political economy of that and what is the disruption it brings into the state schemes needs to be looked at. And like we were saying, the effectiveness, when the diets are so deficient, even in calories and proteins, does fortifying that rice really help in improving anemia? From what I have understood, I'm not a nutritionist, it does not.
Correct.
There are serious macronutrient issues also that we need to address first. So I think we are putting the cart before the horse. We are not looking at what is it that people are eating. Once we do that, you have a decent diet that most people are getting. Some people might still be anemic. Some other people might have some other deficiency because of other reasons. And then you think about supplementation for them or whatever treatment. I think this mixing of food and medicine, complicating food as if it's on the one hand, on the other hand, you either reduce it to like rice and wheat.
Yeah.
But
I think
just
there's
looking
this
at
tendency to do like a broad brush approach and not looking at the specifics of different communities and different age groups and so on and what they need, right? This is a much easier thing to do, even though it's not necessarily effective.
exactly. And I find that quite ironical that, so one is, like you said, India is such a big country, different cultural, economic context requiring different kind of strategies. There you want broad brush, but on the standards, you keep saying that it has to be local specific because that doesn't suit you. So if you argue genetic, then I wonder if a person in, say, Tripura or Nagaland, are they genetically closer to a person in Kerala or somebody in Burma or Bangladesh? You know, where do you draw a line if you fall into this trap of uh, uh, having different growth standards?
Right, right. Is there, you mentioned that you're not a nutritionist, but Piyush asked, is there, there's a reduced nutritional value of grain intake itself? So, and could that be an explanation, at least one of the explanations for the rise in stunting?
So I think that is definitely an area that needs much more research and studies. I remember seeing recently, I think Down to Earth did a couple of stories a few months back on looking at the nutritional content of pulses and millets and grains, where because of the soil quality, climate change and so on, they do argue that the nutritional content of what we are eating itself has been going down. So it could be a factor. I think climate change and all of this is related, but we really are not investing in understanding it better.
Gayatri asked if you know, Coffee and Spear's work on sanitation, could that have, how big a role does it play, particularly in urban India? I think we've already spoken a little bit about the differences in sanitation problems, and could that have, yeah.
Taking on from their work itself, it does seem to. For instance, one is, of course, they show that much of the difference between India and Africa can be explained by the difference in open defecation. But they also, Dean Spears also does this work where he looks at, so what matters is not just whether you have a toilet in your house, but what the disease environment is. So how much is open defecation in the area that you're living in? So
Right.
you might be living in a slightly better off household with a toilet, but you might be living in a slum where there is still a lot of open defecation. Then that child is still affected. So in urban areas with more congested living, one would imagine that that would play a bigger role than in rural areas where it's more open spaces.
Right. That's what we're saying. So talking about how locally specific these issues are. Right? Another person asked about, I'm not fully sure I understand their question, but about the intergenerational transfer of nutritional handicap, but about child malnutrition aspects too. If this person could clarify, they talk about the triple burden of malnutrition, implying overweight and obesity, may also be encountered, not only in intergenerational transfer of nutritional handicap, but child malnutrition aspects as well. And that question mean something to you, or okay?
No, I'm trying to see if I can find and read it and make sense, but
Okay, then okay. If you're listening, if you could clarify your question, we can try and address it. But otherwise, we'll move on to another question here. This question might have been answered already. Actually, Raghupati asked early in the talk whether you could elaborate the difference between standards and references with an example. You mentioned that it is the cause of a lot of confusion, and a lot of the debate gets sort of muddied because of that confusion. So perhaps with a clear example.
So again, standards are where you are being aspirational. That's also what the WHO uses. It's a prescriptive approach. It's telling you what is possible by looking at a set of children who do not have any deficiencies in their environment, who face a favorable environment. So in the case of the WHO study, for instance, the sample for India was drawn from particular localities in South Delhi, which, as we know, is one of the most privileged areas in India. So there were a number of background studies done to see where they should do this study. And they picked South Delhi as the area where they would do it, because they felt that that was one of the locations where they studied where there was the most favorable environment for growth. On what basis did they make that decision? They made it on the basis of not just the economic status. So even within South Delhi, they chose mostly gated colonies and apartment complexes, where when they did this study in 2001, the average income was 45,000 rupees, which is really high. Like it must be around the top 1% or less of the of the economy at that time. Another, in that population, which was included in the MGRA study from India, more than 90% of the mothers and fathers had completed 15 or more years of education. So were graduates, right? This is in 2001. 2022, we still have only 40% of mothers who completed class 10. Right? So the population that they took is very privileged.
Extremely privileged, yes.
No question about them being extremely privileged. And non-smoking mothers, mothers who were practicing breastfeeding. And on top of that, you had in the longitudinal sample, people going and telling them, now you have to start complementary feeding and this is what you have to feed your child and so on. So it is a privileged set of people, but that is the whole point, that if this privileged set of children in India can grow like a child in Norway or US, that tells us that any child in India, given such an environment, can grow like that.
Yeah.
That is what we are saying. So that is why it's a standard, that you need all of that to change. Reference, on the other hand, would be to say, okay, you look at Indian children today and you look at how the top 10% households children are growing, and then you compare rest of the children to those children. Right? So that reference could be anything. It can be top 10%. It could be, so standard also is a reference in some way, but it has very stringent conditions on what is that population that you're comparing with. Whereas a reference is some benchmark that you take based on your given population, but that is not necessarily reflecting the best that can be achieved.
I have a couple of more questions here. I think we'll use this to wrap up the discussion. One Gayatri asked, actually, she's asking about something that you brought up in the very first slide. She's asking, given that issues to wasting are more easily resolved, she's asking, are issues related to wasting more easily resolved, seeing that wasting has more acute cases, acute causes? You were speaking, I think your talk has largely been about stunting, but I think it's good to revisit something that you brought up at the very start here.
Yeah, so I did say that I would focus on stunting, because wasting, again, not being a nutritionist, I'm a little wary about drawing conclusion, but based from my field practice and from what one looks at the data, wasting by definition, yes, is short term, right? It's acute malnutrition. So the underlying factors behind wasting could be a recent infection, could be some economic shock to the family, and therefore diets have reduced and so on. So when we do field interventions, we do see that it is much easier to affect wasting. So for instance, I've been part of a intervention with PHRN and others, where we run creches and do some PLA and system strengthening, where when the evaluation was done, there was a significant reduction in wasting in those areas where these interventions were done. But stunting was much slower to reduce in these direct intervention areas. So usually if you just take a little bit of care of the disease environment and feed children appropriately, decentralized, local, diverse sort of foods, children start gaining weight, and that shows in an improvement in wasting. But the overall national trends are showing these stagnant wasting levels in India. But that we also have to understand that wasting is also seasonal. It depends on the time of the year when the survey was done. It comes and goes. So the national trends, I don't know how to explain, but it is true that in a program at the field level, it's much easier to address wasting. And we have seen that in various programs. I see that Dr. Veena Shatrughna is here,
Yes,
so maybe
yes,
this
yes.
is the kind of thing
I
that
think
suddenly her name popped up. So yeah,
I think she
would
would
be
like
great
to
if-
speak. So
yeah, I think
so,
she would be a better person also for this.
Dr. Veena, if you could go ahead and contribute to this conversation, we'd love to hear your opinion.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
No, there are 2 or 3 points. Deepa, congratulations for a wonderful presentation. But I want to really bring your attention to that data from CNNS, which says around 11% of children in the age group of 6 months to 24 months get adequate quality diet. You know, that's the growth phase where children put on about 20 centimeters of height. If you look at the growth of children, it's the first 1 year and then it's 12 centimeters trend. So the period you're talking of is 25 centimeters, the fastest growing phase, and they do not get enough food. So I wish a little more time was spent on how much food a child needs in this phase to put on that 25 centimeters. I mean, nobody in our lives will ever put on 25 centimeters later. So if you've lost that phase, the first 1,000 days, as they say, we've gone. The second thing is height is a multi-gene determinant, is determined by multiple genes. So poor Panagaria and all the others know a lot of figures, jugglery, but really know very little physiology. It is multi-gene. That's why the closest we come to is to say, for a population, if the child is mid-height or parent height, because in India, fathers are invariably taller, then you know the child is growing. But secular changes in height have been happening very well in the upper socioeconomic group, which means across generations, the younger generation is growing taller. There is data. And so to take resort to genes is very lazy science and lazier economics, I would say. And it's very unfortunate that we are still discussing it. And what was the other thing you want me to talk about? I don't. Yeah, about stunting. See, the moment your stunting reduces, your wasting increases because you put on height, but your weight doesn't keep. You've seen children who are chubby and suddenly they grow tall. They look so thin. The phases, growth phases that you see of kids who are growing around 11 and 12, suddenly boys are looking thin, girls are looking thin, and then they put on weight. So even in under fives, the moment stunting decreases, which means children are taller, you'll have more of wasting. But that has to be addressed with food and a little more discussion on why is it we can't give our children foods that are child friendly, like milk and eggs and bananas and vegetables, whatever that khichadis that are made with vegetables. We just produce a diet for children, which is a stunted version of an adult poor diet, which is rice and very little pulses. I think quality of foods must be stressed as far as possible. Otherwise, we are not going to bone and muscle required for putting on height is not made with rice. So it doesn't matter if the quality of grains are going down, because rice is not meant to be a source of micronutrients. It's really vegetables and fruits and eggs and milk and other foods that micronutrients must come from all the other foods. Rice is a source of energy. So let's not breastbeat and say Green Revolution was bad and this was qualities. Yes, a few milligrams go here and there depending on the soil health and the agriculture inputs that are put in, it's very clear that you have to get your micronutrients from other foods, not from rice gives you energy. We eat rice and wheat for energy, not for micronutrients. Now, suddenly we add 2.5 micronutrients like iron, folic acid, but there are now 300 kind of molecules that a human body requires, which are antioxidants, anti-cancer agents, you name it, flavonoids. You're not going to add those to rice. I think we are making a mockery of food by shutting out all the foods for whatever reasons. It's vegetarianism, it is people who want only organic food, people who want the new breed that are coming with, who will not even touch milk, etc. So and people who only talk of millets. Millets are also come in the category of cereals, and they are as good or bad. They may have high calcium, etc., but they're not absorbed. They have so much of oxalates and anti-nutrients, they don't get absorbed. So these fashions of one new cereal and another one coming out every few months is not going to be the solution. A food plate must contain all the foods from all the food groups. I think with that I should stop.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Veena, for providing that context and the detail I think necessary here. Do you have a few more minutes, Deepa? We have two questions that I think are worth.
If I can just add one more data
Sure.
point to what Dr. Veena said, of course, completely agree. So there is FAO estimates this cost of a healthy diet. So what they do is that they look at the national nutrition guidelines, and there is a debate on whether the ICMR guidelines themselves are sufficient or not, but whatever. So for India, it will be the ICMR nutrition guidelines. They look at different local centers, the cheapest source of food that could meet those guidelines, right? And they create a sort of a benchmark diet and look at what the cost is and estimate the cost. Then they compare that with the average wages of that area. And if the cost of the diet is taking up more than 52% of your income, then they say that the diet is unaffordable, because you do need your income for other essential spending as well. So 52% is sort of the benchmark that they have, that an adequate diet should not, a healthy diet should not cost more than that. Even that is quite a bit. For India, 71% of Indians, by this estimate, cannot afford a healthy diet. And I think that's quite a striking figure, again, in relation to what Veena is showing. So it's not about anemia. It's not then zinc will become the fashion one day and then something else the other day. It is really about what is it that people are eating and what is it. And of course, there are all these cultural factors and so on, but affordability is a huge issue as well. Even if they knew what they should eat and there were no any cultural factors, they cannot afford to. 70% cannot afford a healthy diet. And I think these are the numbers we should be looking at now.
Correct. Absolutely. Do we have a few more minutes, Deepa? Just two more questions, I think. Srilatha asked, what's your view on the effectiveness of conditional cash transfer programs such as have worked in Latin America? And, and is there an issue with that sort of transferring responsibility from the public back to individual responsibility or family responsibility?
Again, I'll try a short answer. So I think conditional cash transfer, there are many issues with conditional cash transfers. Once again, first, that they are not a magic bullet either, which is how they came in. It depends on, they could be an additional sort of, for some things they clearly work, like the Janani Suraksha Yojana clearly worked in bringing women to the institutions. But we do know from JSY literature itself that that did not contribute very much to reducing maternal and infant mortality or morbidity, because the quality of the healthcare did not improve as much. And, that was slower. So there is the conditional cash transfers work when there are many other conditions that are in place. The foremost being availability of services and good quality of services, because the conditions are usually linked to access to services. In most cases in India, they have been seen as a substitute to spending on services, which is not how they were done in Latin American countries where they began. So all the literature in India will keep saying how conditional cash transfers would reduce the subsidy burden and that allocations can be lower, but that's not the case. You need the services to be in place. So you need universal ICDS for those nutrition health education sessions to happen, for the women to attend them. Otherwise, there is no point in having that as a condition. So, and where even Bangladesh, Alive with Thrive, this recent literature also shows that cash transfers work when they're in combination with food supplementation as well as BCC as part of a package. As a substitute, they don't work. I mean, as a short answer. So if we had to prioritize, I would put in place first the service delivery, because the market fails. I mean, as economists, this is something we learned right from our undergrad days, that these are things for which the market fails. You do not get optimum solutions through the market. So you do need the state to intervene. So conditional transfers can be a complement to the various other interventions, which would include supplementary nutrition, which would include maternity entitlements, childcare. All of this conditional cash transfers cannot take care of. They can take care of then the remaining behavioral aspect they could help
It's like
with.
a late
But even
stage. Yeah, it's a late stage
yeah, and
intervention.
even that would require, along with the cash, telling people why
How
they're
best
being
to
given the
how
cash and
best
what
to
they should do.
yeah. Okay. The last question, I think, is a good way to wrap up this discussion. Lakshmi is asking you to reflect on whether there's the changing nature of dialogue, between nutrition researchers and activists with, policy making bodies. Whether how the nature of this conversation has changed over the years, and has this contributed to, is there a crisis in policy change? Is there somebody who's been
I
working
think
in this space for 20 years?
Yeah,
We
I
want
think
to
we've had different phases. There was a whole phase when a lot of this dialogue, I feel, was led from the ground, by people's movements. It was that period when the Supreme Court was also very active on the issue of the right to food and related that to nutrition. So the phase where we saw the universalization of midday meals or the expansion of Anganwadi, all of this was quite bottom up. It was not just the Supreme Court. Had there not been mobilizations in different parts of the country on this, it would not have happened. And that was the period when also, and it like the quality of supplementary nutrition, all of these were raised, and there was a pressure on the government to increase allocations and increase the investments in these. So if you look at even the ICDS budget in 2004 to 14, there's a tremendous increase that happens in these things. I think alongside, even in that period, there is this thing of working together and tension between the experts or the technocrats and those on the field. So there was a period when there was some kind of a convergence between the two, where the technocrats, those who are more technical in nature, could see the point of view of those in the field as well. But I think there is a bit of a regression in that in more recent times. It's once again become very technical, the whole nutrition area.
Yeah.
I mean, one is not saying that it's wrong. Of course, it has to be based on science and scientific evidence. But at the same time, medicalizing nutrition and also mystifying the whole thing doesn't really help. And I think we are once again in that sort of a phase where it is quite mystified. A grassroots activist finds it difficult to talk about this because there is so much jargon and so many, whereas something like dietary diversity is something that everybody understands and understands how it should be addressed as well. So I think we go up and down, but currently, even with the government, there is greater space, I think, for this kind of evidence-based research than field experience-based. And I wish there was a greater balance in this, where the voices from the field were also heard more.
Right.
Because when they were, there was a lot of richness that came into policy making.
Okay. Well, that's, I think, a wonderful note to end this discussion on. Thank you, Deepa. As I said, the talk itself was wonderful, but I think the discussion has been even more illuminating. We were able to, I think, bring a lot of nuance to the points that you brought up in the main talk itself. Really appreciate you being here today. We've learned a lot from you today. To all of our attendees, thank you for attending, and many of you for sticking around until the end. We will have the talk up on YouTube soon for people to listen to. Thank you so much, and we will stay in touch.